Hi, everybody, and welcome to a foggy day on Olympus where we explore history, religion, and culture and why they matter. For those maybe not fully up to speed on their classical references, Mount Olympus was the place where, of course, as you suddenly now remember, the Greek gods lived. So, an Olympian judgment, of course, is an assessment utterly dispassionate, impartial, and delivered from far above the mad squabbling of mere mortals. And of course, it's what we aspire to, but the fog, the fog.
And today's topic we've called Forever a Child, Why We Can't Ignore History. So, leaping straight in at three main reasons that we should have or might have for looking at the past, studying history. And we'll say a bit about each of these in turn. First off, simply curiosity, engaging with past societies. It's often said, as a sort of semi joke, that history is the cheapest way to travel. And it's true that many people study the past for the same reason that people visit exotic places, go on vacations, because it's interesting in and of itself to to see how other people live, how they think, what their experiences are. And in fact, the form of history that is biography, except when it's being read by academic historians for reasons of their own, but just popular historical biographies, that's the reason that most people read them. Just that kind of curiosity. It's certainly not to be despised, and it's a starting place for almost everybody. Secondly, to understand ourselves and the world that we now live in. You could take almost any example, but take something really obvious like the letters of our alphabet or the meanings of more than half of our words. As soon as you start to think about those questions, you need to consider the Roman Empire, right? And what was that? When was that? Why did they use these letters? And we've got them, and so on. But the principle holds at least as strongly for our ideas. Those ideas are mostly not common sense. We all like to flatter ourselves that the things we think are just common sense, which then becomes a bit of a problem when we disagree with people who think something else. Very few things really are common sense. If you drop an object, it's going to fall to the floor. Eventually everybody dies. These kinds of things are actually common sense. But most of the things that we think are the products of particular times and places. And if we want to understand them and interrogate them, then we're going to need to look at where they came from. And thirdly, understanding cause and effect. And so to acquire wisdom, which again hugely increases our ability just to function in the world. Okay, well, concerning the first of those, curiosity. I've just flagged up something here that's very personal to me. I'll tell you a little bit about my story. I'm one of those people who's been fascinated by history since possibly even before I can remember. Certainly as a very small child, and most people aren't like that. I fully realise. Um, and what actually captured my imagination and curiosity at a very young age was this series of books, Ladybird history books. And they were produced in the late 1950s, I think 57 through to about 1964, and stayed in print for quite a while after that. Written by someone about whom I know very little, rejoicing in the wonderful name of L. Dugard Peach. And these books, they were half a crown, which is an expression of currency about as meaningful now as a groat. I realise this is pre-decimal Britain, so 2 shillings and sixpence, or 12.5p in new money. Britain went decimal in 1972. A historical fact worth remembering if you want to understand what I just said. And these books were 50 pages each, 25 pages of text, and facing each page of text was a series of absolutely beautiful illustrations that awakened certainly my curiosity from an extremely young age, and that never went away. one of the central purposes of all education, not just history, but any subject, should be to awaken and sustain curiosity, whether the students are small children or adult or anything in between, of course. And one of the things I found as a teacher, one of the most frustrating things was that our school systems do the opposite. Uh, One of the saddest things I found was that loads of students, and again, maybe it might seem mean or unfair for you to reflect on particular individuals you might have gone to college with, but I'm sure there were plenty, although not in the honours class that you were part of, who actually were bored by almost any subject they could have studied. They were there for things that were nothing to do with study, putting off getting a job for 4 years, hanging out with friends and stuff like that. Because I would maintain the school system had done a lot to squeeze the curiosity out of them. Does that resonate with you at all, or did you find that with?
Well, yeah, you mean in college
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
or before college?
Well, they would have lost it
Yeah, I think
through what had happened before.
right, right. Yeah, I was just thinking about that because what's interesting is, by the time I got to college, I wasn't really interested in academics anymore. I actually, as you may remember, went to college the first time to ride horses and become an Olympic professional rider, which didn't pan out. Hence the reason you and I are here today.
Yeah, this is your fifth choice. I realise. Yeah, I'm
Right. Yeah,
trying
I'm
not to
glad
be
that you know
crushed
that.
by that.
Yeah, you look like you're handling it well.
Yeah,
But I was sort of thinking that, coming into your classes, I joined the honors program like all freshmen did because I wanted to go to Europe and walk around and explore what the culture was like over there. And I think the material was sort of a second,
right.
a second hand interest for me. But I found out as I sort of went along through your classes, against my will, I will say, I found myself really enjoying it and wanting to know more and wanting to understand things. And I'm guessing now that I have to attribute a lot of that to you, although begrudgingly I
The
may do
first nice
so,
thing
but
you've ever said to me. Are you all right? Oh, you're already sitting down.
well,
I should put my hand up
well,
and
it's
take your
true.
temperature. Yeah. My goodness me. I'm going to cry now.
Well, don't get used to it.
Okay, no.
Yeah. Camera. Yeah. Nobody wants to
but
see that.
but I mean that was one of the things that I found that I was having to push back against whatever the opposite word of incuriosity, I suppose, to try and get people
Right.
belatedly to a place where they found they were curious. I mean, in a sense, of course, you were curious, but the very fact that you wanted to go overseas and see cool places or whatever it was, right, showed that there was at least some
Yeah.
curiosity there, right? But for
Yes.
loads
Right.
of people, there isn't a lot. But which is strange because small children are naturally curious, and it gets squeezed out of them through our schooling
Yeah.
process. And I'd want to maintain certainly it's not just history, but history is perhaps one of the best opportunities, or maybe I just think that because it's what I'm enthused about, to enthuse people and to make them curious. Yeah.
So this is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about these days for reasons that you're especially apprised to. But can you give us just like a few ideas about what do you think was different when you were young Mike Pierce going to school versus what children experience now?
Well, of course, I was rather unusual because I was the only kid in the class sitting there with a moustache and wearing a waistcoat. But I'm not sure. I mean, a lot of it was about expectation, about how we were expected to behave and to interact. And so a lot of it is like peer group dynamics, and they either work for a good outcome or against it. And I think that they expect as expectations have sunk, so outcomes have sunk to match it. That's certainly part of it. I also think that I was extremely fortunate in having some brilliant teachers. I can reel off the name of the teacher of my class in every year in primary school, like infant school, because they all made an impact on me, and in every case, good. In some cases, like really good. So, so I think I was very fortunate in that sense. But what they clearly all internalized was that here are these young, infinitely malleable children, and you can use that for good purpose to enthuse them. And for me, I mean, I was obviously far more capable of being enthused about some subjects than others, but we're all like that. That's not going to change even under the most optimal conditions, I think. Well, going back to
Right.
these books, it was I don't know whether it was really the text, but the text was absolutely fine and reflected the outlook of the period in which it was written, as you might expect. But it was the illustrations that kind of just sucked you in. And I have to admit, I realise this might sound almost embarrassing, but even at my advanced age, almost senile, really. Well, maybe, yeah. Anyway,
You can say senile.
I can say sea lion. Ah, yes, sea lion. That's what it was for my kids. This is something to do with the Jennings books, and most people listening won't know what that is. So never mind. Right. When the books dealt with topics about which I've subsequently learned very little, Cleopatra in ancient Egypt, the career of Alexander the Great. Like most people, I know more than the basics. Right. The visual images that come to my mind more than half a century later are the pictures in those books, right? And that's, or even things that I know a lot more about, Roman Britain or something. Ditto, right? That's the kind of impact that they had because they awakened curiosity. I want to know more, and that shouldn't be understated, really. So yeah, and part of the point of the curiosity about the world in general, again, not just in history, and never mind these kids' books, is to get us constantly to think in terms of how might things look very different, and then to wonder why they are the way they actually are. And it predisposes us to enter into the heads of people in different cultures in the present as well as in the past. At one point, I don't know if we'll get time to mention this, but much later in my life, when I started to get involved with the Balkans, I was at first confused by the attitudes and the way, let's mention it now, the way that people thought, the way that they talked. And suddenly, after a while, I realized that they had strong similarities to a certain period in the past in English history, which I did know all about. And suddenly it was like scales dropping off my eyes. And I realized, okay, we're dealing with people here who are less modern in their outlook on the world than I've been used to all my life. And it functions like this and this and this. Right? So it helps you to get into other people's heads. Okay. Um,
Something we should avoid when it comes to you, perhaps.
sorry, say that again.
Getting into other people's heads is probably something we should avoid when it comes to you.
That's really good of you. Thank you so much. Huh. Okay, so
Anytime. Cheers.
yeah. This is back to the world as we know it, right? After all the tear jerking earlier on, right? Okay, to secondly
Yay.
understand ourselves in the world we now live in. So we have here this famous quotation, which we gave half of in the title, from Cicero, the first century BC Roman orator. Not to know what happened before you were born is to remain forever a child. Well, in what sense is that true at the micro level of our own experience in bringing up children or seeing them being brought up?
Meaning that children need guidance from parents who are presumably wiser because they have experience of how things work or what might be dangerous. For example, they have a longer past to draw upon.
Right, and that is like a micro version of history, right? Your personal history is longer than that of a 4-year-old kid, right? Mine is longer than yours, and so on. And that is why in traditional societies, especially in smallish communities, and most people who've ever lived have lived in very traditional societies amongst relatively small groups of people, perhaps a few dozen or at the most a couple of hundred. That's why in those kind of societies, people deferred to the wisdom, as they call it, of the old, because those people had experienced more things than the rest of us. And you've got to remember that until very recent times, most people died in, in their late 30s or early 40s, late 20s in some societies. So being old was an achievement, right? And they had a bigger fund of knowledge about how to deal with unusual situations. And they, in themselves, represented a success story because they'd succeeded in surviving. Right?
How does the same thing work at the macro level, at the level of public affairs?
Well, it's the same principle, only telescoped right backwards over much longer periods of time. Well, let's not go back very far just for a moment. I I often make the mistake of thinking that I know about, say, the basic politics of Egypt in the 1970s when other people don't because I'm a historian and they're not. But I'm wrong about that. It's because I was paying attention to the news back then and they weren't. Either if they're my age because they weren't paying attention, or if not, if they're younger because they couldn't because they weren't alive or they were only five or something. But even if we're mentally lazy like that and we weren't paying attention, we can hardly help ourselves. We, all of us, look at the world around us and ask, in one way or another, why is this thus? And the more fundamental the question you ask, the further back you have to go. Okay, let's suppose that you say to me, Mike, why are you wearing those clothes? And I could say, well, these were among the first things that fell out of the cupboard when I opened it, which would be kind of true. But if you wanted to push me on the point, if you wanted to push me on the point, I could say, well, oh, you mean like why am I wearing smartish clothes? Well, we're going to make a podcast, and a few people are going to see me, so it'd be a shame if I was trotting around the house in my PJs. We're pushing the thing back a little further. But if you wanted to say, no, why clothes like that? Well, this is what's been accepted as reasonably smart in societies like ours for several generations. So that's the custom. But if it was somewhere, if this was in India, I'd be wearing something different. Or if we were making this podcast back in 1830, then I'd be wearing something different again. All right. But if you wanted to push me a little further and say, well, no, why like this kind of thing, and I could say, oh, you mean like not handmade clothes, but like standardly factory produced. Well, back a couple of hundred years ago, there was this thing called the Industrial Revolution, when when clothes are made like this rather than handmade or hand sewn garments, right? But if you want to push me back some further, no, why are you wearing clothes? Well, back in Genesis chapter 3, the more fundamental the question you want to ask about anything, the further back you're going to have to go. Uh, to take something perhaps a little less silly, let's reflect on some of the kind of material we were dealing with in the last series about the history of Israel and the Jews. Now, as you know, and as our viewers have now long since intuited, we studiously avoided engaging with all the stuff that everybody's shouting and screaming about now, this moment, right? Because that would have been a distraction, and we couldn't offer anything better informed about the minutiae of that than various sources are talking about, which you can find just anywhere, not here. But let's just engage with that just a little bit. Why is this horrible mess happening in Gaza? Well, a good answer to that might be, well, on October the 7th, 2023, there was this terrible massacre perpetrated by Hamas amongst Israelis, and this is the Israeli response, right? That's a very superficial level. But if you want to push back a bit and say, well, why would Hamas do that? Why is there a Hamas? Then we need to talk about how they come to control Gaza in 2006 and come into existence in the 1980s as part of a general movement across the Muslim world towards political Islamism, pushing aside Arab nationalism that had preceded it as ineffectual. And then someone might come in and say, wait a minute, Gaza, what? Why is that packed full of Palestinians? And so then you have to push the thing back further again, and finally you get back to the creation of the state of Israel to understand why there's been this conflict in the first place. And then someone might come along and say, well, why the Jews were there in the Old Testament? Why did they need to come back? How did? And then you need to go back to the kind of material we discussed in the second episode of the last series. So the more fundamental the question you want to ask, the further back you've got to go, and that it seems to me that that's like a constant in these discussions.
If we wanted to ask why Mike Pierce is the way that he is,
Oh,
how far back would we have to go for
so unkind to me. Why do we do these podcasts? I don't know. Anyway, it's a
that? I'm really
mystery,
not sure.
too distant in time and too dark to look into, I think.
That I believe.
Right? Yeah, yeah. I thought you would. Okay, so let's come to this quotation from Patricia Crone and her inestimable book, Pre-Industrial Societies. She says, we all, modern Westerners, take the world in which we were born for granted and think of the human condition as ours. This is a mistake. The vast mass of human experience has been made under quite different conditions.
Now, if that doesn't make you want to run out and grab a history book, I don't know what does.
Yeah, it should do. It should do. You,
I'm unfortunately very familiar with Patricia Crone and pre industrial societies for some reason and somebody's particular fault.
yeah, yeah. Well, one of the little cruelties that I inflicted on students was to make them read it. I do you know that there was some of the reading on that East Meets West program that students loved, and a couple of books they hated, and this was one of them. And I didn't understand. I still don't understand why. I think it's brilliant. I'm sure you were amongst the majority who didn't like it. Do you, at this long distance in time, remember why?
I really don't. I think it was just too complicated and sort
Abstract,
of
maybe.
spun out to really.
Yeah.
What's that?
Too abstract, maybe.
Yes, that's the word.
I,
Too abstract.
yeah, I would have thought and had hoped that her thought experiments, like a bunch of us get washed up on a not a desert island, but an island somewhere after a shipwreck, and we have to invent a society from scratch. That would kind of like appeal to students, but it didn't seem to outweigh all her abstract theorizing about societies as a whole, which was a shame. Um, yeah. She
It's
was I hope she's still alive, but she must be quite old by now. A historian of the Muslim world. Um, but she'd obviously looked at a wide range of societies and used that to generalize about what industrial pre-modern societies all had in common, right? Even though they varied, say some phenomenon like religion, and which has been very various across the globe, but she wanted to look at why nevertheless they did all have something like that, or why they were all based upon agriculture, and what the implications of that were for certain kinds of ruling classes and so on. Was kind of materialist in her view of the world. I don't know that she was philosophically a Marxist, but if someone were to tell me that she was, I should not be in the least surprised. But that doesn't take away from the very real and important insights in her book. She's saying that all of us take the world in which we're born for granted and think of the human condition as ours. And we can see that most easily when we look at a small child. A child that's been brought up under extraordinary conditions, maybe some horrible household, and that they're probably very unhappy, but they couldn't tell you why. But nevertheless, they think that is normal, right? Which in itself is doing them terrible harm. But because all
right.
children think that their own experience is the human experience, right? And all of us tend to do that. Why, if a foreigner really is very different to ourselves, we think of them as being somehow odd, even though they're not. That's that's perhaps a fairly universal trait, but for modern Westerners, it's particularly unfortunate because the real odd ones are us, right? Our lived circumstances, our lived experience is way out of sync with everybody who lived before a short time ago. That makes us, unless we work quite hard, very ill equipped to deal with people who haven't had our kind of lived experience because we can't easily relate to it. Related to that, let's come now to one of my favourite ever internet memes. Other cultures are not failed attempts at being you.
Is a very piercing and sarcastic way. And you're sure you didn't actually create this meme because I strongly suspect that you did. It's a very sarcastic way of saying that other cultures have to be understood in their own terms. I mean, that they weren't remotely thinking of our own kind of arrangements or ideals as some long term goal.
Loftily ignore the insult. I didn't create it, but I wish I had. It's a huge. This is a huge issue it's pointing to, and I found an excuse to show this meme to, I think, every class I taught. It's saying in the most crushing way, you can't duck out. You have to make the imaginative or empathetic leap, or you will understand nothing. And once again, we're back to that whole issue of curiosity. Yeah, we can't simply assume that people in the past were trying to be us any more than you can assume that a completely different culture today are simply failed attempts at being ourselves. They're not. They have their own agendas, their own beliefs, their own cultures that are precious to them. An issue like, and it might sound very contentious, particularly in the current climate, slavery. Um, Slavery was in use in not all, but very, very many societies before modern times, and of course, it still exists in certain parts of the world. Most slaves didn't think that slavery was wrong. This will come across as a very shocking thought to many people, right? They personally didn't want to be slaves. Actually, a very small minority of them did, either because they couldn't see any other way of living, or in a few very fortunate cases, they had extremely exalted positions as slaves in certain societies. We'll ignore that tiny minority. But most of them didn't want to be slaves. But that didn't mean that they didn't that they thought that slavery was all wrong, because that wasn't really conceivable to them. That's is in itself a modern or modernish idea, right? Well, that's a rather graphic example, but many other respects as well. People in the past weren't, longing for a decent welfare state in the future with central heating, and they're not thinking in those terms, right? Working within the parameters that they know about, because they too think of the human condition as theirs. So back to this from Patricia Crone then. The difference she points to is obvious in respect of material prosperity. And certainly when I was teaching in college, this was one thing that students all latched onto and assumed that was the crucial difference. They assumed that people in the past were basically poor, low tech versions of themselves, right? Basically, like themselves, minus smartphones and TVs and cars and indoor plumbing. But what else is she likely referring to?
Probably differing religious beliefs or different ideas about social hierarchy, different assumptions about the structure and place of the family, maybe different ideas about the rules that govern us as individuals or in a group and who gets to make those rules.
Yeah, all of those things. are connected, admittedly, with differences in wealth and technology. They feed through into completely different attitudes towards personal relations or politics or society as a whole. Now, without knowing a whole lot about the distant past, let's just take something very, very recent that all of us above the age of about 15 or 20 have noticed. Just look at the effects on us of social media, for example, right? We can all see that it's not simply about technology, because if it was only about technology, we'd say, well, that's good. I can talk I can talk to Coel in the States, and she can talk to me here in Croatia, and this has got to be good, right? For example, children have always bullied one another, but it's only very rarely led to suicide. But with the advent of social media, bullying and shaming is amplified online. If you're the object of it, there's no escape from it. And the other thing that affects all of us to one degree or another is that we lose our inhibitions a little online, and we really need to keep ourselves in check, or we can start to say rude things to one another that we wouldn't, you know, if we were really in the room with one another. And potential bullies lose even more inhibitions and become a kind of cyber mob. And then we turn around and find that suicide rates start to skyrocket. And depression rates, particularly amongst teenage girls, skyrocket even more. I mean, that's not a contentious point. Anybody can find the figures online for themselves. So, so there's a very recent example of an extremely powerful technological change that actually feeds through into all kinds of on social relations and power dynamics and even politics. Right there was back in 2010 the so-called Arab Spring. There was a revolution in Egypt. Unfortunately, it didn't last too long and was reversed about 4 or 5 years later. As crowds came out onto the street to demonstrate, they found the courage to coordinate with one another to demonstrate against the Egyptian government of the day and brought it down and briefly brought in democracy. And I remember the remark of one demonstrator, ecstatic that their movement had succeeded, saying to a TV journalist, "Thank you, Facebook." Wow. Because it was indeed Facebook that had made the revolution possible. Right? So it's not that the technology doesn't matter, but that feeds different states of technology and wealth are they're not wholly causes, but they feed through decisively into how we interact with one another, what is possible or not possible in any given society at a particular point in time. Again, about how people in our society think that we have much more relaxed ideas about family relations or the sanctity of sex and marriage because of our ideals of freedom. Again, is a huge mistake. The reason that too many of us mistreat our families or abandon our spouses is because we're no longer in danger of starving to death as a result, right? A rich society where we can move around, reinvent our lives or careers in a new place, make new friends, and the families we abandon will be kept alive on welfare or by the generalized prosperity of the society they live in. We do it because we can. In the past, Puritan prudery had very little to do with it, or rather, it chimed with common sense in the 17th century, less so in a wealthy society. I was just listening just on the news last night about a decline in the divorce statistics in the UK. Now, I have to confess that I think and kind of want to think that the reason for the decline is because there's been a decline in marriage, right? So in the end, there's fewer married people to get divorced, and I still think that's part of it. But the commentators were pointing out that actually there was a decline in living standards during and immediately after the COVID pandemic, and that caused loads of people who would otherwise have broken up to stay together, and it was one of the causes of the dip. Well, that's just a small blip, right? But if you think of the transition between the level at which we live now and the level at which people were living in 1900, say, that's going to be part of it. Right? Her point can help us to understand our own ancestors better. and also to start to take account of cultural differences, even in the present world, the likely reactions to different situations of ordinary people in, I'm making this up, but say India or Turkey. Well, let's come to that sage C.S. Lewis, who seems to have something masterful to say about almost everything. And here he's making the point that the person who accepts all the ideas of his or her own time and place is like the peasant who believes all the superstitions of his native village. He says, most of all, perhaps, we need intimate knowledge of the past. Not that the past has any magic about it, but because we can't study the future, because it hasn't happened yet, yet we need something to set against the present to remind us that the basic assumptions have been quite different in different periods, and that much which seems certain to the uneducated is merely temporary fashion. A man who's lived in many places is not likely to be deceived by the local errors of his native village. The scholar, and he means here, he's saying in a rather snooty way, and I'm afraid this is one of the downsides of Lewis. He was a bit snooty. The person who studied history, say, has lived in many times and is therefore in some degree immune from the great cataract of nonsense that pours from the press and the microphone of his own age. And I've got to admit that studying history, it gives us, certainly it's given me a wide range of vantage points from which to come at current phenomena or problems. We're no longer slaves to the immediate. And I suppose, I mean, obviously, most people aren't going to be like me. Gosh, it'd be terrible if there were even one more, wouldn't it? But I find that I just can't look at loads and loads of phenomena in front of my eyes right now without mentally, instinctively comparing it with something else in another time and place, or at least thinking, where did this come from and what caused this, and understanding it in those terms. So, as with studying any discipline, it will give you a certain temper of mind after a point. The same would be true of chemistry, I guess, or anything. One experience I had when teaching college, it was quite towards the end of my time in teaching in Houghton, actually shocked me very much, though it's a very small thing. What we've got here is some quotations from Barron's New York State Regents Review, instructing students to start history essays in high school, right, with these foolish phrases. Throughout history, history teaches us that since the beginning of time. Now, for a number of years, I encountered these kind of phrases at the start of student essays, and I immediately assumed that the person writing it was an idiot. Right? That's what that told me straight away. Right? That this is someone who's not at all engaged with history, not even trying to understand the thing which they're studying supposedly in its own terms, and merely trying to ham it through their paper. And then, after some years, I found out that they'd actually been told to do this. I'm a man not really burdened by anything that might meaningfully be called a conscience. So it wasn't so much that I felt bad, but I was just shocked this was drilled into people. Now, I know you were homeschooled, but all the same, did you get these kinds of instructions from some textbook or other to write this way? Or not really?
Well, I have to admit that before coming to college, I don't think I wrote very many history papers. And if my poor mother is listening to this, she's probably feeling a little embarrassed. And she shouldn't because she was a great teacher. I'm afraid I don't have any evidence to back this up.
Okay. You'll have to pass on that one then. Okay.
Tell us, why are these phrases so foolish? Why do you have such a problem with them?
Because embedded in the questions is or the phrases, is the insistence that people in the past were really just like ourselves, which is fine if we want to reassure ourselves that the beliefs of our own time and country are eternal verities. But since they are not, we'd do better to leave off loading the dice in this kind of fashion. There are some things that people have always wanted, food, security, sex, shelter. Actually, I might be wrong about the order there. Maybe sex is even more important to people than security when you think about the risk that some people are willing to run. Anyway, never mind that. We won't go there. Right, those things. And on top of that, people have always been sinful, and they've also always had a sense of something or someone beyond the material. They're instinctively religious in some sense. The kind of thing that Romans 1 and 2 talk about in respect to the sin and the instinctive sense. Beyond that, there's nothing much that is always about human societies. They differ enormously. And by kicking off with these phrases, we're insisting that that's not so. And therefore pushing away the very thing that we're there to study, right? To understand why people in the distant past, and you could extend this in the present to people in totally different societies to ours, why people in their own estimation act as they do. And that's the key phrase. Why, in their own estimation, do they act as they do? And what we're saying at the start here is we're not going to do that. We're going to assimilate them to our own categories. I'm afraid I did find that very, very shocking. Well, finally, the third of our motives for studying the past thing, well, not ignoring it, is to understand cause and effect, and so to acquire wisdom in how we govern our lives, whether as private individuals or collectively. And here I want to come to a rather famous person, Niccolo Machiavelli.
Oh, Machiavelli, wasn't he the author of the notorious book The Prince?
He was. And as a result, he's had a reputation over the past 500 years of being an agent of the devil. Actually, do you remember why?
Well, he was recommending to princes that they should sort of act, a little unscrupulously and kind of break their promises whenever it suited them and never allow defeated enemies to live in case they might get revenge for themselves later on.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, we've still got the adjective Machiavellian, meaning a sort of an unprincipled schemer. Now, I'm not sure whether how fair this is. Maybe it was. An argument is made by a number of scholars and historians, and I'm afraid I'm not equipped to adjudicate on this one, that actually he was saying this not as a sort of joke or tongue in cheek, but as that he wasn't saying this sincerely. He was saying it as a criticism of the princes of his day, and certainly he had fallen foul of the authorities in Florence and was in disgrace. So that he was writing this to describe how princes actually did act as a sort of revenge upon them. Now, I don't know how far that is an explanation for what he said there, or whether he really does deserve the reading it on the surface reputation that he's got. But this next passage, which is not from the Prince, written at a time I think when he was still in favour in Florence, is absolutely beautiful, and what he has to say about conversing with the ancients. When evening comes, I return home and enter my study. On the threshold, I take off my workday clothes covered with mud and dirt and put on the garments of court and palace. Fitted out appropriately, I step inside the venerable courts of the ancients, where, solicitously received by them, I nourish myself on that food that alone is mine and for which I was born, where I'm unashamed to converse with them and to question them about the motives for their actions, and they, out of their human kindness, answer me. And for 4 hours at a time, I feel no boredom, I forget all my troubles, I do not dread poverty, and I'm not terrified by death. I absorb myself into them completely. And of course, what he's talking about is going into his library and reading the classics, whether from Greece and Rome or what for him will have been more modern times, and reading and learning from them.
His sentiments here sound a bit like what it's like walking around your house.
Yeah, is that a compliment or another insult? I'm starting to lose track. Yes. Well, its inhabitant bears small resemblance to Machiavelli, or so my students tell me. He can at least see that uh, wisdom consists in learning from the past and not just reading about past events, but learning from past authors. After all, he's still living in a society where you continue to venerate the old, and who could be older than somebody who's been dead for hundreds of years? So, and the fact that their writings are still, well, printing did exist by his time, but their writings are still circulating, shows how valuable what they had to say was. Finally, let's move on to consider what history isn't, because one of the many dragons I had to try and slay, and gosh, it was like Sisyphus constantly rolling a rock uphill, only for it to roll down again. You had to start all over again. Was doing battle with misconceived ideas of what history is, and to get to that, we need to consider what it isn't. It is not a catalogue of the constant triumphs or eternal victimhood or a combination of the two of your country or ethnic group or religious faction. And it's not a vindicating or consoling narrative bearing out the rightness of your personal beliefs.
Partisan or patriotic or pious. History is always either boasting about its supposed greatness or complaining at how unfairly the world has always treated it, with the implication that this makes them morally purer than anyone else.
Yes, yes. I think we can all recognize certain people that we've met in that sort of description, really. You know, your country, and I'm not talking here about America, whatever your country is, didn't always exist. It only came into existence by violence. Its coaptation of the medieval past, or from Americans, maybe Puritan New England, is a fantasy. Those events happen, well, some of them did, didn't mean to the participants what your modern national fantasy says that they meant. Right? That's a more recent product. Just one example from the Balkan history that we looked at, the Battle of Kosovo Polje is far more important today than it was in 1389, right, which was when it was fought, because of what so many people in Serbia want to think about it and its meaning and significance. Right? And something similar could be said for loads of past events. Your ethnic group, whatever it is, contains as many rogues as heroes, although even those two categories are problematic, and it always has. It's undoubtedly has all manner of unique features, but so do all the others. And far from being pure, it doesn't contain a single ethnically pure individual. I mean, I know these days, hopefully, we're all agreed at how evil racism is. But frankly, if it wasn't for that, if it wasn't so evil, we would just laugh at it. None of it would survive mass DNA testing all around. And your religious denomination has often acted stupidly or betrayed its founding principles on numerous occasions, might even originate in misunderstandings. I'm thinking of some concrete examples as I say this, without being any the worse for it. Well, relax, it might not even be wrong, but it doesn't have a monopoly on rightness. And perhaps most importantly, history is not a self vindicating or consoling narrative. Actual events, if looked at whole and in the round, confound every ideology, even yours, maybe especially yours, I don't know. If we want vindication of our politics or our religion or of our country, what you really need to go is go and read politically correct school history books, pious biographies of heroic preachers, or titles containing the words "what they don't want you to know about," or what's a supposedly historical Hollywood movie. But if we want to understand why the world is as it is, we're going to need to reach for something a little more challenging. Because, I mean, one thing that the past does have in common with us is it wasn't neat. It wasn't being lived out to vindicate the things that you want to think now. It was a hopeless, tangled mess, just like now. And people were bumbling through, just like now. That is another constant. So when teaching introductory classes like Western Civ, I used to say to students as a kind of a joke, but a serious joke, that there are two types of school versions of US history that you will have imbibed in high school. If you went to public schools, you'll probably have been exposed to Garsley Howard Zinn and his A People's History of the United States, or something very similar, in which America is absolutely terrible. It's an entire catalogue of racism, sexism, homophobia, oppression of the poor, and everything. And of course, it's pushing you towards a certain kind of politics in the present. Whereas if you were homeschooled or went to a private or a Christian school, then you will have had a rah rah, stars and stripes, faith and flag version of America as the greatest country in the world, and so on and so on, so forth. And I got smiles all around the classroom because everybody was nodding away. They had indeed imbibed one or other of those two things. And at the end of it, my counsel to them was the truth isn't somewhere in the middle. It's not. You need to, it's something completely different again. You need to just throw them away because they both take for granted something that's false. That education, perhaps especially history, consists somehow of collecting factoids that can be hurled like pebbles at the misbelieving others, right? And that's not what you're going to get in my class. and as people have by now found out, that's not what they're going to be getting in these podcasts. They're going to be getting a dive into the tangled mess.
Speaking of which, are you done venting now?
Yes, I feel better. Wait, what?
Well, that is why we're doing this, right?
Yes. Well, okay, let's just finish on one more little picture here. It's of something very, very often quoted. And this is Georg Hegel. We learn from history that we don't learn from history.
That's rather depressing. I mean, if he's right, is there any point in studying history?
Well, yeah, of course, I think I want to say yes, but why? It's probably too cynical. One suspects that Hegel meant it as a joke, giving vent to his exasperation at human stupidity. But of course, he does have a point. Take a classic example. All my life, self styled wise old men have wagged their fingers about the dangers of appeasing dictators. And the lesson that was supposedly learned from Britain and France in the 1930s, appeasing Hitler, we were told was why we attacked Milosevic's Serbia in 1999. Right? That lesson was explicitly invoked. And Saddam Hussein's Iraq in 2003. Well, but the reality is, those regimes didn't represent the kind of existential threat to the rest of us, no matter how horrible they were in themselves and threatening their neighbours, didn't represent the kind of existential threat to the rest of us that Hitler did. And when the lesson was really needed in the face of Putin, who does represent an existential threat to all of us, what did we do in 2014? In fact, what are we about to do now? What our ancestors did in the 1930s, which was maybe why our ancestors did what they did in the 1930s. So we can learn from the past, but to do it, we need a lot more than just knowledge, although we certainly need that. We need empathy. The world doesn't look the same way to other people as it does to you. You need to understand how others are thinking, how they're likely to act. We need wisdom, humility, a sense of the big picture, not being locked into the immediate. And we need moral fibre, character, courage, and will. And it does have to be said that we're not terribly good at any of those things. Well, on that sobering note, we'll come back next time to look at different ways that people have understood history. But if you like this vodcast, that is a word, is it right? Vodcast. That's what we're doing.
It is.
Vodcast. Right.
It
Okay.
is.
Get with it, Pierce. Right. If you like this vodcast, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. There's a little black dot over on the right side you can click on, and then you're subscribed, and you'll find out about all the others. And or follow us on our Facebook page, and please repost the link to this vodcast on whichever social media you use. So we'll look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, everybody, and goodbye.
Goodbye now.